निहारिका मैम, हेलो. निहारिका मैम. बीना मैम, हेलो. योगेश जी, योगेश जी, आप हैं? योगेश जी.
Sir, I think, hello?
Yes, sir.
Sir, I think Yogesh sir hasn't joined yet. So I think we can wait for a few minutes and then we can begin.
अच्छा, ठीक है. और अभी डॉक्टर निहारिका लाल भी शायद she has also.
Okay, okay, sir. Okay, okay.
निहारिका मैम, आप आ गई?
हाँ जी, आ रही है.
अच्छा, नहीं, डॉक्टर निहारिका लाल है शी लाइन. योगेश जी.
हाँ राजेश,
हम लोग शुरू करें क्या? मैंने बीना मैम.
हाँ, यस यस यस, वी शुड, वी कैन.
ठीक है, तो आप बीना मैम को इनवाइट कर दीजिए. शी शुड इंट्रोड्यूस द स्पीकर.
Hello.
Bina.
A very good afternoon to everybody present over here. And before we don't have much time now to wait for the audience, and I am very much convinced that people have got a bit confused about the timing, as it was initially from 3 and onwards. So we can start, I think, keeping in mind the constraint of time given by Professor for today's lecture. May I request Professor Beena to please take the charge of initiating this further ahead. Please, Madam Beena, Madam, please take over the charge and move ahead.
Ma'am, please unmute yourself. You have muted your mic. Afternoon, ma'am. Please unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am, now it's okay.
Yes,
On? Now?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, friends. I welcome all of you on the behalf of English for Nation and Vasant Kanya Mahavidyalaya to the series of this lecture. Today we are going to have the fourth lecture. It is my proud privilege and immense joy that I have been given this joyful opportunity to welcome someone who is so near and dear to me. Without taking more time, dear participants, it's really great and wonderful to introduce someone who actually needs no introduction. But maybe my students are there and some new participants. So following the decorum, I take this wonderful moment to introduce our honorable speaker today, Professor Sanjay Kumar. Professor Sanjay Kumar is not only in the Department of English BHU, but he has also taken care of as professor to Malviya Center for Human Values and Ethics, and as well as IIT BHU. It is really a great pleasure to share with all of you that Professor Sanjay took the initiative of setting up a multidisciplinary research center for intercultural studies at BHU. There are so many honors to him, but some of them are really very outstanding, excellent laurel to his crowning glory. It is great to share with all of you that Professor Sanjay Kumar has been twice Fulbright Fellow, first at Boston University, USA, and then secondly at University of Texas, Austin. He is very well, I would say, versed and connected and doing excellent work in cultural studies, and that is why we are very fortunate to hear him on cultural trauma and pandemic. I know we all are going to really benefit something very enlightening and inspiring and motivating from the vast experience, research experience of Professor Sanjay Kumar. But just like to mention one of his, there are many books and more than 50 research papers that he has published, but his latest book, I would like to tell you friends, China, India and Alternative Asian Modernities. That is his latest book. Professor Sanjay, it is a real pleasure and honor to welcome you as our speaker today. We all are waiting eagerly to hear you. Don't want to come between you and the audience. So the mic is all yours. Once again, welcome, Professor Sanjay Kumar.
Thank you, Professor Beena Singh, for such a handsome introduction, which I hardly deserve. I hope I'm audible.
I didn't share much. There is such a whole big list of it. I just shared very little, Professor Kumar. Yes, sir. Continue.
Thank you very much.
Continue, sir.
Am I audible to you?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
My voice is coming through?
Obviously, sir.
Okay, fine. Okay, so, well, I begin with an invocation and a prayer. Sarve bhavantu sukhina, sarve santu niramaya, sarve bhadranu pasyantu, ma kaschit dukh bhag bhavet. I wish and pray for the well-being, good health, and safety of all. Stay home and stay safe. Let me also take this opportunity to congratulate Vasant Kanya Mahavidyalaya and especially the Department of English, and also this forum called English for Nation, and especially more particularly my colleagues and very good friends, Dr. Beena Singh, Dr. Rajesh, Dr. Yogesh Dubey, for successfully organizing this lecture series. Friends, this afternoon, in the course of next 30 to 40 minutes, I propose to talk about two things. First, cultural crisis, why and how it is caused. And second, cultural trauma, which is closely related to the idea of cultural crisis. So, cultural trauma and pandemic, how a discourse of cultural trauma is constructed around a pandemic. And if time permits, I would also like to talk about the role of culture in the spread of pandemic, how our cultural behavior often facilitates or impedes the spread of pandemic, and also how pandemic in turn affects and changes the world around us. So let me begin by quoting a small passage from a canonical text, a text which has been hugely popular with students of literature, but has never been read in the context of epidemic. Although the epidemic forms the backdrop of the text. The text that I'm referring to, and I'm sure you must have guessed it by now, is La Peste, or in English it is translated and called The Plague by Albert Camus. This novel, published in 1947, takes us through a catastrophic outbreak of plague in the fictional town of Oran on the Algerian coast, as seen through the eyes of the novel's protagonist, Dr. Rao, who many consider a version of Camus himself. And you see, when Camus wrote this novel, he was not writing about any one plague in particular. He was drawn to the idea of plague because it was very close to his absurdist philosophy that the universe has no meaning and our lives are contingent. And plague to him represents the universal condition of absurdity because it kills people indiscriminately without any rhyme or reason. And that is why he was drawn to the theme of plague. He was not interested in epidemic as such. But let me, that way, quote him out of context, because what I plan to do is to read him in the context of epidemic. So let me quote this brief passage. This passage runs like this: a pestilence is not a thing made to man's measure. Therefore, we tell ourselves that pestilence is a mere bogey of the mind, a bad dream that will pass away. But it doesn't always pass away. And from one bad dream to another, it is men who pass away. They thought that everything still was possible for them, which presupposed that pestilences were impossible. They went on doing business, arranged for journeys, and formed views. How should they have given a thought to anything like plague, which rules out any future? Now, the reason I quoted this passage will become clear to you in a moment. Now, you see, one of the significant statements in this passage is which presuppose that pestilences were impossible. So what makes us presuppose that pestilences are impossible? So in fact, in this passage, Camus refers to two things: man's hubris and pride, and the second, complacency born out of that hubris. And according to him, these two, hubris and complacency, have been the greatest enemies of man. And this becomes obvious from this statement. What makes us presuppose that pestilences are impossible? It is precisely man's hubris and pride. And then secondly, how should they have given a thought to anything like plague? Refers to man's complacency born out of this hubris. Now, what he wrote in 1947 was highly prophetic, because it came to pass roughly 2 decades later, which made us think that pestilences are impossible. In 1969, the Surgeon General of the United States declared the end of era of infectious diseases, that we are not going to have infectious diseases anymore, any longer. And international public authorities, including the World Health Organization, they echoed what the US Surgeon General had said. And they too announced that it would be possible by the end of the 20th century to eradicate one microbial threat after another, beginning with malaria and smallpox. And so much so that Yale and Harvard, two of the best known medical schools in the world, they closed down their departments of infectious diseases, assuming that infectious diseases will not recur or will not happen again. And so tremendous has been our faith in the power of science and technology that we began to think that the infectious diseases were a thing of the past. And we overlooked all evidences, in the sense that so far you will be surprised to learn that the scientific community so far has developed successfully vaccine for only one disease so far, one viral disease, and that is a smallpox. Even polio, which we thought we have eradicated from this world, now there are evidences emerging from Africa that polio has re-emerged. And yet, it was to man's hubris and pride that we claimed that infectious diseases were a thing of the past. And especially the developed world, the societies of the West, they thought they are invulnerable to new epidemics. But now we find in the times of Corona that the developed world, the so-called West, is the worst hit by this epidemic. The maximum number of casualties have taken place in America, and the number is still rising. Of course, we are also not lagging far behind, and probably sooner or later, the manner in which the numbers are rising, it looks that we will soon overtake America and Brazil, and will be the number one in about a month's time or so. In any case, if we care to look at the last 3 decades, the decades in which the West, the developed West, had been busy pronouncing the end of the era of infectious diseases, you find that in these 3 decades alone, there have been a number of epidemics from what I call A to G, from AIDS and avian flu through SARS and Ebola to Zika virus. Right? But fortunately or unfortunately, the Western world didn't have to bear the brunt of these epidemics. But with the coronavirus, what has happened is that the developed world is as much affected, or rather more affected, than the rest of the world. And I think, in a way, it has come as a warning to the mankind, to all of us, that there are limits to what we can do to nature, what science and technology can do to nature. If we cross the limit, it is going to rebound on us. And it is time that we learn the lesson. If we learn this lesson, I think this will be the greatest gain to humanity. And if we don't, and there is every likelihood that we won't, I'm not being cynical, then this will be the greatest loss to humanity. I'm not being unduly pessimistic or being cynical, but I have a reason to say so. You see, our whole effort is geared towards what? In this Corona time, our whole effort is geared towards finding a vaccine which can prevent or cure Corona. And we are hoping that in next 3 months or 6 months from now, we will succeed in discovering or finding the vaccine. And here too, what we are witnessing here is a kind of a competitive nationalism. Each nation competing against the other in order to beat the others in the race for finding a vaccine. You're all aware, all of you are familiar, that only, I think, about a week back or so, Russia claimed to have discovered the vaccine or invented the vaccine, and it has started taking the credit, and the other nations started saying that no, they have it is not yet passed through the various systems of check and balances which a vaccine needs to pass through, and each nation is claiming. China is claiming, India is claiming, America is claiming. So instead of thinking about how to help humanity, each nation is competing against the other. Each nation is treating other nations as a rival in the race to discover and find this vaccine. But the point that I'm trying to make is that why all our hopes are placed on finding a vaccine. It is good that we find the vaccine or the cure. But what is really worrisome to me is the assumption, the thinking that goes behind this attitude or behind this endeavor or behind this hope of finding the vaccine. And that is, let me explain this assumption and correct me if I'm wrong. The assumption behind finding this vaccine is that once we are able to find the vaccine, once we succeed in finding the vaccine or cure, we can happily revert or go back to our old ways of living as if nothing had been remiss. This whole corona event or episode then might be relegated to a mere footnote in history of modern civilization, a mere blip in time, or a temporary setback, just as it had happened in the case of the Spanish flu of 1918, the worst epidemic that mankind has ever known. Now, with these prefatory remarks, let me come to my topic. And in the course of next 30 minutes, I will talk about how a cultural discourse is important in our perception of the trajectory of an epidemic, and how a certain kind of cultural discourse is constructed around an epidemic, and that becomes the template through which we view and perceive that epidemic. And also, how cultural behaviors are important when we look at how infectious diseases spread in human population. Now you see, most of the viruses and pathogens are parasitic in nature, and they require a host to remain alive and also for transmission. In absence of a host, no bacteria or virus can be transmitted. Without the host, they cannot also survive. And it is through the hosts that they spread. And when human beings become the host, it turns into an epidemic or pandemic depending on the scale of the infectious disease through human to human transmission. And it is here, in this chain of transmission from one human to another, that culture becomes important. Since culture is all about how we interact with others, and this virus is also spreading through our human interaction. And that's why culture becomes important as I said, since culture is all about how we interact with others, how we relate to others, and therefore our pattern of interaction with others also affects the transmission and the spread of the disease or the epidemic. Now, you see, culture is one of the fundamental ways that shapes how we live in the world. And as the saying goes, we are all familiar with it, man is a social animal. This phrase social animal is important. It shows that we are both, as animals, biological beings, and as social beings, also we happen to be cultural beings. So, at the animal level, we are biological beings, and at the social level, we are cultural beings. So, man is both a biological and cultural being. And when a disease spreads through large parts of the world's population, we cope with that disease in both biological and cultural ways. When faced with an epidemic or pandemic, our bodies have biological reactions. How our immune system fights a virus or disease. Nowadays, we are getting plenty of messages on social media. You eat this, you drink this kadha and that liquid, and eat this and that in order to boost up your immunity. Right? So that is basically, we are talking about us as a biological being, how we respond to that disease as a biological being. But at the same time, we as groups of people, as communities, as nations, as Indians, Chinese, Spanish, Americans, and so on and so forth, have our own cultural responses and cultural reactions to the epidemic. And these cultural reactions vary from one culture to the other, depending on our way of life, depending on our cosmologies, depending on our economic and social systems, depending on how our families are structured. And the impact of the epidemic is greater or lesser depending on the particular actions and behaviors of different groups. In other words, what I'm trying to say is there is no universal rationality when it comes to the way people behave during an epidemic. People often make decisions based on their own needs, priorities, and particular situations, which are all influenced in a way by culture. So different sets of people or different groups of people react differently. And I don't know whether you have noticed it or not, right? How we as a country or people all over the world have responded to the threat of corona. Japan has not responded the same way as we have done. South Korea has responded to corona differently. Vietnam has responded to corona differently. US has responded to corona differently. Right? And that has largely to do with their cultural and social systems. And history tells us that every major pandemic in this world has been exacerbated and aggravated by our cultural behaviors in one way or another. For example, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic which was the worst, as I said, killing 50 to 100 million people in 1.5 years. And this was aggravated largely by large scale population movements and also censorship of the press due to wartime restrictions. You would recall that a Spanish flu occurred roughly around the same time. It overlaps, right? It occurs roughly around the same time when the World War I is happening. And you see, during this World War, there was a large scale troop movement, the movement of soldiers across the borders to different battlefronts, and sometimes movement of troops across the continents, American troops traveling to Europe, right? And these troops traveling in packed trains, they all became the couriers of the virus. Right? The troops fighting in trenches, getting wounded and being taken to the hospitals in hundreds and thousands. The hospitals became the breeding ground. The army camps became the breeding ground. The trains became the breeding ground. And yet, because of the exigency of the war, the troop movement could not be stopped. Similarly, the censorship of press did play a significant role. Right? By the way, I don't know how many of you know how this epidemic, this influenza pandemic of 1918 came to be known as a Spanish flu. You see, during the World War I, literally the entire Europe was involved in the war either on one side or the other. But Spain was a neutral country. It was not fighting the war on either side. And you see, during the war, there was press restriction in all the countries which were participating in the war, because they thought that any kind of adverse news, bad news, unpleasant news will hit the morale of the people and the fighting forces. Right? And I will cite just one instance. There are many hundreds. I'll just cite one. In America, Woodrow Wilson was the president. Although America was a late entrant to the war, it was in the beginning of the 1918 that it decided to join the war. So Woodrow Wilson issued a presidential proclamation for press censorship, and it was called a sedition law, something like the sedition law in our country, that you say anything against the government and it becomes a case of sedition. And that is precisely what happened in America during the wartime, that Woodrow Wilson issued a presidential proclamation, a presidential decree, that anybody writing, speaking, saying anything against the war efforts, it would be punished. And that would be considered as a case of sedition, and they would be tried as per the law. And as a result of that, all news about this pandemic was suppressed in America. No press, no magazine, no TV, no nothing would write even a single word about this pandemic. And it so happened that on 28 September 1918 in the city of Philadelphia, they announced what is known as a Liberty Loan Parade. I will not go into the details of why that parade was organized. Let me just explain it in one sentence. That parade was organized in order to raise money through the selling of government bonds for supporting the war effort. And despite the warning of the doctors, the city council decided to go ahead with that parade. And literally 200,000 people, do lakh log, they participated in the parade. And you see what happened. The flu symptom, the Spanish flu symptom, used to take 2 to 3 days to reveal itself or to appear, to emerge. And from third day onwards, right, hundreds of thousands of people started falling prey. And literally thousands of people died of this Spanish flu. And this was all because of that parade, which was organized. Right? So this is how our cultural behavior often affects the spread or the prevention of epidemic. Now coming back to this Spanish flu. So because the rest of all other countries had press censorship regarding the Spanish flu, only Spain, being a neutral country, it was a free press there. And therefore, the news about the flu was freely published. And therefore, people started calling it a Spanish flu, thinking that it had first appeared and emerged in Spain, but which was not the case. It had first happened in America, but because of the press censorship, the news was completely suppressed. Now, let me here talk about the notion of crisis, especially cultural crisis. Since every major pandemic threatens to disrupt and change the very way we live, so this cultural crisis occurs when there is a large-scale disruption or suspension of some basic elements of our socio-cultural life. This cultural crisis is of, broadly speaking, two kinds, going by the factors or conditions which give rise to them. The first is what is called survival or existential crisis. The second is what is called axiological or value crisis. Now, this survival or existentialist crisis, the survival crisis is called survival crisis precisely because it puts our very survival at stake. It primarily affects the very possibility of the existence or the survival of an individual and his society. A society may experience such kind of survival or existentialist crisis when its culture is inadequate to cope with the problems of its social or cultural or natural environment. And it is often brought about by factors more or less beyond human control. For example, all natural disasters like earthquake, flood, drought, and even epidemics or pandemics like corona, they are things beyond human control. And in all such instances, survival crises are practical emergencies. Right? You have to survive. The second crisis, which is called axiological or value crisis, this is brought about by human actions. The survival crisis, as I said, is often brought about by factors which are more or less beyond human control. But this axiological or value crisis is often brought about by our own human actions. It is a direct result of some kind of dysfunction inherent in the very form and dynamics of a given culture. Such crises originate primarily from cultural causes, such as the assumed incompatibility of two or more cultural systems. For example, all instances of colonization. When the Britishers came here to India, right, what happened? The incompatibility between the culture of the colonizer and the culture of the colonized, right? And therefore, the culture of the colonized undergoes a kind of a severe axiological or value crisis. Right? Second kind of cultural crisis is when cultural systems or there are conflicting social interests or cultural interests. For example, all kinds of racial issues, black and white, all kinds of gender issues, man, woman, male, female. Right? So these are conflicting social interests. Or for example, for that matter, the issue relating to caste in India. Right? So these are what we call axiological or value crisis. In short, the survival crisis involves the preservation of our social existence, to be or not to be, right? Whether you will survive or not. So the question here becomes to be or not to be. In the case of axiological crisis, it refers to changes and transformations in the very form or system of values of a given culture. In other words, how to be. In survival crisis, it is to be or not to be, but in axiological crisis, it becomes the case of how to be. What kind of life is worth living and preserving? Many of the axiological crises need not have occurred and could be avoided or averted, but for our cultural behavior. Now, this survival or natural crisis, this often tends to unite people across racial and cultural differences in the face of some common catastrophe or potential danger. For example, during a natural disaster, say an earthquake or flood or famine, you see, people often rise above their race, caste, creed, gender, religion to undertake relief works and help the victims in the name of common humanity. During the time of an earthquake, during the time of a famine, when you are going to help a victim, you don't ask whether you are a Hindu or a Muslim, whether you are a white or a black, right? Whether you belong to a particular caste or not, and accordingly I will help or I will not help. Right? So during the such crisis, we often tend to rise above such narrow social and cultural differences. And under such circumstances, nature appears as the common opponent of mankind or humanity. And in this sense, a survival or natural crisis makes the whole world a kin, a family, or what we often call Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And thus, it appears that survival or natural crisis tends to unite human beings as members of the same species, whereas axiological crisis tends to separate people into conflicting groups because of their cultural differences, as if they were members of different species. But surprisingly and ironically enough, the survival or natural crisis posed by corona is producing effects akin to axiological crisis. Instead of rising above our narrow social and cultural differences and even national differences, it tends to divide people across nation, across race, across religion, across caste, and across creed. For example, US blaming China, US blaming WHO, one religious group blaming the other. You would recall when corona thing was in initial stages in India, you would recall the controversy regarding the Jamatis, that these are the people who deliberately did it, right? The rich blaming the poor and vice versa and so on and so forth. So instead of coming together to fight this epidemic, we are rather indulging in a kind of a blame game, or what one may call a scapegoating, blaming some other group, that look, that group, that China is responsible, the Muslims are responsible, the poor are responsible, and so on and so forth. Excuse me. So, to my mind, the basic social and cultural challenge or the problem of our time is how to produce a sense of cultural kinship, a sense of human bonding, which may be instrumental in obviating cultural conflicts or to parallel the sense of natural kinship in the face of this survival or natural crisis of corona. Let me refer here to another concept which is closely related to this and which is also, which I consider it important and relevant for our consideration, and that is the concept of cultural trauma. Now, this cultural trauma occurs when members of a group or a community feel that they have been subjected to some kind of an horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their community or group consciousness, marking their memories forever and changing their identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. In other words, cultural trauma, this phenomenon of cultural trauma, refers to an invasive and overwhelming event that is believed to undermine or overwhelm one or several ingredients of a culture or the culture as a whole. In this context, I would like to quote Neil J. Smeltzer, who has worked a great deal, a scholar who has worked a great deal on this notion of cultural trauma. He says, and I quote, "Only if the pattern meanings of the collectivity are abruptly dislodged, a traumatic status is attributed to an event. It is the meanings that provide the sense of shock and fear, not the events in themselves." So, this notion of cultural trauma assumes that no event or experience, however traumatic, is inherently traumatic. It is the interpretation and meaning given to an event collectively, the meaning and interpretation which we accord to an event, not individually or personally, but collectively, which makes it traumatic. In other words, trauma stems from the mental processing of an event, not from the event itself. For example, look at what happened in the case of Corona. The world had come to know about Corona in the last week of December, or probably around the first week of December. I think it was 31st December of the last year, to be precise. But then literally, for 2.5 months, the world chose to ignore it, downplay it as if this is of no consequence. Look at our own case, the Indian case. When there were less than, first it was said that nothing is going to happen to us. This is happening in other places, this will not happen to us. But when the cases started coming here, being detected here, you see, what kind of measures did we take? When there were less than 500 cases, we went for complete lockdown. And now that the cases are rising exponentially, I think roughly around 70,000 cases a day, we have gone for what is now being called unlock 1, unlock 2, unlock 3, relaxing many of the, excuse me, relaxing many of the restrictions. The threat has not abated. In fact, it has increased manifold now. And by that logic, we should have made the lockdown more strict and taken extra measures to control the spread of the epidemic. But look how the rhetoric through the course of this Corona in last 4 months or so, it has changed. Initial interpretation was, or initial meaning given to it was, Jaan hai to jahan hai. And therefore, we went for complete lockdown. But then, it changed to Jaan or Jahan dono bachana. Okay. And then now what it has happened, although it has not been proclaimed, but now it is obvious to all of us, as far as the government is concerned, कि जान तो अब अपने आप अपनी बचा लीजिए, हमारी कोशिश सिर्फ जहान बचाने की है. Whereas the actual situation probably would be न जान बचेगा न जहान बचेगा. But look how the interpretation has changed. The disease is the same, and in fact the gravity or the intensity of the disease has increased manifold. But look how the interpretation has changed. over last 3 or 4 months. And that's why I'm saying that no event in itself is inherently traumatic. It all depends on the kind of meaning that we give to that event. So you see, the manner in which our discourse and response to Corona has changed in the direction of more and more relaxations and lifting up of restrictions, even going on to hold exams and so on and so forth. And it is in this sense that I am asserting that not the event itself, but what we make of an event, how we interpret it at any given point of time is important. Now, if you look at the mechanisms of such interpretations, the mechanisms of such interpretations are those of social agents and contending groups. Determining and defining of cultural trauma must be done or must be established by deliberate efforts on the part of cultural carriers, or what one might call opinion makers, or the cultural specialists such as politicians, intellectuals, journalists, priests and preachers, moral entrepreneurs, and leaders of social movements. These cultural carriers and entrepreneurs make claims about the event and create and construct a discourse around it. And this discourse typically cites some fundamental injury to the nation, profanation of some sacred value which the nation holds dear, a narrative about a horribly destructive social process, and a demand for emotional, institutional, and symbolic reparation and reconstitution. For example, the cultural carriers, politicians, journalists, physicians, doctors, scientists, they seek to frame the epidemic as culturally traumatic, as a threat to the nation, not just as body politic, but also significantly as imagined community. For example, see what has happened in the case of Corona. It is not just a threat to the individuals who suffer from it or who are afflicted by it, but it has become a threat to the nation as an imagined community. An important feature of this discourse is that it privileges the collective experience of the epidemic over individual experience or personal experience of it. After all, in the case of an illness or disease, it is the person concerned, an individual, who is hit by that disease. And it is that person who suffers, nobody else. अगर मुझे दर्द हो रहा है या बुखार है, तो सिर्फ वो मुझे महसूस होता है. It is not experienced in collectivity. That pain is experienced only personally, individually. It cannot be experienced collectivity. But in the cultural discourse or narrative of the epidemic, this I that is so prominent in the illness narratives, the personal I, the individual I, that is so prominent in the illness narratives, gives way to the collective we of the nation. And since our understanding of ourselves and the world begins with our reliance on the orderly functioning of our bodies, as the saying goes, healthy mind resides in a healthy body, it is hardly surprising that in this pandemic discourse, the implied body of the nation replaces the material body of individuals as the locus for knowledge about the collective experience of the epidemic. This national body assumes preeminence over individual body. Let me remind you here again that such a discourse or narrative is always constructed. It doesn't happen just naturally or automatically. Take the example of the Spanish flu of 1918. As I said, the worst pandemic that we have ever known, and it claimed anywhere between 50 to 100 million times. India being the worst sufferer with losing almost 50 to 20 million lives. Almost 6% of the population of India was wiped out, was killed because of the Spanish. And yet, such a narrative or discourse was never constructed. If you look at the writings of that period, you would hardly come across any reference to the Spanish flu. You see, Mahatma Gandhi himself, he was struck down by a Spanish flu. And he himself writes in his autobiography that during this flu, during this week that he was afflicted with the Spanish flu, and fortunately for all of us that he recovered from this Spanish flu. He writes in his autobiography that during this period, I had lost all interest in life. Forget about the nation, he had lost all interest in life. But fortunately, as I said, he recovered quickly. But after that, there is absolutely no mention. Look at the literary writings of this period. I have so far come across only one book. And that is a novel called Twilight in Delhi by Ahmad Ali, which was published in 1940, where there is a reference to this Spanish flu, which was known in India, which was called in India, Naya Jade Ka Bukhar. And it's only Ahmad Ali who specifically and directly refers to this Spanish flu and how it afflicted the city of Delhi, how people were dying in hundreds and thousands. Right? And he is describing a scene at the graveyard, saying that the grave diggers were so overworked, right? Because there were so many bodies coming and there were so many graves to be dug that they ran short of hands. And finally what happened was that in one grave they will dig one pit and they will dump several bodies. Another instance is again Nirala, the great Hindi poet, Chayavadi Kavi Suryakant Tripathi Nirala. शायद आपको पता हो कि निराला का पूरा परिवार, उनकी पत्नी, उनकी बच्ची, उनके जितने अधिकांश रिश्तेदार, सारे लोग इस स्पेनिश फ्लू से गुजर गए. He was in Bengal and he received a telegram from his home that his wife was suffering from the Spanish flu, and by the time he reached home, his wife was already dead. A couple of days later, his daughter also passed away. उनके घर में उनके चचेरे भाई थे, उनका चचेरे भाई का परिवार था. एक एक करके वो चचेरे भाई जिन लोगों ने उनकी पत्नी के लाश में कंधा दिया था, 100 में कंधा दिया था, one by one they all died, including the land workers, जो उनके घर में काम करने वाले बनिहार वगैरह थे. They all died, so much so that Nirala writes कि 100 को कंधा देने के लिए भी कोई नहीं बचा. और फिर नतीजा ये होता है कि he also writes कि there was not enough firewoods, इतनी ज्यादा लोग मरे और उनको जलाने के लिए लकड़ियां नहीं मिल रही थी. And as a result of that, instead of cremating people, instead of burning the bodies, cremating the bodies, people were literally dumping the bodies in Ganga or in rivers. लेकिन निराला भी इस पूरे वाकये का जिक्र सिर्फ अपनी एक किताब में करते हैं, और वो एक उनके दोस्त जिसका नाम था कुली भाट, उसकी बायोग्राफी लिखते हैं, उसकी जीवनी लिखते हैं जिसका टाइटल है कुली भाट, और उसी में इस घटना का जिक्र करते हैं. उसके अलावा उनकी राइटिंग्स में कहीं भी स्पेनिश फ्लू का जिक्र नहीं आता. पूरी दुनिया में there are only very few writings, scarcely few writings where you come across direct reference to Spanish flu, because people did not construct a discourse around this Spanish flu. Again, take the example of AIDS or HIV. This AIDS discourse devolved into a battle over a body specifically perceived as not representative of the nation because of its initially alleged or perceived association with homosexuality, the gay male body, because initially it so happened that AIDS used to afflict, not always, but most often, the homosexuals, the LGBT community. And since this LGBT community is not considered as the representative of the nation, and therefore, it was not considered, it was a discourse around AIDS was not constructed as a national cultural traumatic discourse. But the corona discourse is considered as the representative of the nation. And therefore, the national body takes preeminence here. This privileging of the national body has at least two important consequences for individuals. First, in the name of preserving the metaphorical body of the nation, various sanitary and public health measures are exercised on the real bodies of individuals. For example, all these prescriptions like frequently washing your hands, wearing face masks, making spitting in public a punishable offense, social distancing, or what one should call physical distancing, carrying Arogya Setu app on your mobile, traveling restrictions, and so on and so forth are the measures. To be sure, the principles of public health justify many or most of these measures. After all, the disease and its human-to-human transmission is a fact which one cannot ignore. But the second consequence of this is that individuals are, however, regularly reduced merely to a number, a numerical or a statistical index of the population as a whole as a result of this. Reports about the epidemic reveal little more than morbidity and mortality figures, the death figures. And therefore, look at the newspapers, the TV channels, and other media, how the pandemic is reported. Total number of cases reported in last 24 hours, cases recovered, cases active, how many deaths in last 24 hours, total number of deaths, and so on and so forth. Right? But there are no individuals mentioned by name here. Right? And what bare figures like these reveal is the focus on the impact of the epidemic on our nation or society as a whole. Right? Individual identity is almost completely elided. Like Foucault's argument about the birth of social medicine, the epidemic discourse takes an interest in individual only insofar as they combine to constitute the state. In fact, as you will notice, Corona discourse rarely mentions anyone by name unless he or she is considered a significant actor in the epidemic. For example, Dr. Randeep Guleria, the director of AIMS, who comes regularly on TV media to brief us about the progress of or the state of Corona in the country and so on and so forth. Or else, it might be a person of consequence for some reason or the other, or like a celebrity. For example, Amit Shah, Pranav Mukherjee, Shivraj Singh Chauhan. Their names are mentioned precisely because they're people of consequence. That look, Pranav Mukherjee is also suffering from Corona, Amit Shah is suffering. But otherwise, no names are mentioned. Right? And there are usually, I will now wind up, I have spoken long enough. This is the last point, major point that I want to make. There are usually 4 stages in the emergence of this epidemic discourse or pandemic discourse. The first is called progressive revelation. First, the communities resist acknowledging the presence of an epidemic. They deny that no, everything is normal, nothing has happened. It is just a case of flu. Because acknowledgement would threaten interests, a specific economic and institutional interests, and more generally, the emotional assurance and complacency of ordinary men and women. The second stage is called the management of randomness. Despite initial resistance to admitting the reality of an epidemic, the empirical evidence soon becomes too much to ignore. Even when you go on saying that everything is normal, but soon there will be so many cases and so many casualties that you will find it now hard to ignore it. So there will be the empirical evidences soon become too much to ignore. And epidemics are chaotic, and as such, they pose a threat not just to people's health, but also to the very pillars on which a community is founded. And if the community cannot rise to the challenge of the epidemic threat, it risks both disintegration and reorganization. In other words, it can fall apart or be replaced by a different social order. And to meet this challenge, then communities seek an explanatory framework with which to make sense of the epidemic. And the third stage is what I call negotiating public response. It involves taking actions of symbolic value for community, which results in the visible acting out of community solidarity. For example, this is what we did twice, this kind of symbolic action. thariya lota bajana, diya jalana, right? These were all symbolic responses, and in a way we are trying to negotiate public response. So measures like this to interdict an epidemic constitute rituals, collective rites, the whole country coming together at 9 o'clock in the night to light up diyas or to collect on the balconies and terraces of our respective home at 5 o'clock in the evening or baith ke ghanta baja rahe hain, right? So all these measures are basically a way to integrate cognitive and emotional elements. And in this sense, these events play a similar role, the visible acting out of community solidarity. The final stage is what we call subsidence and retrospection. This happens after the epidemic has finally subsided. And the time it takes for this to happen allows communities to take a stock of their response to the epidemic, reassessing the values on which they are founded. These epidemics always provide an occasion for retrospective moral judgment. So these are the 4 stages through which a cultural trauma discourse framing an epidemic passes. So far in our country, we have had 3 stages of this emergent corona discourse. In Europe, in China, they have already arrived at the 4th stage. The 4th stage of moral retrospection will come only after the corona epidemic has finally subsided. I think I have spoken long enough. Let me stop here. I have talked about the concept of cultural crisis, concept of cultural trauma, how certain events or epidemics are recorded the status of cultural trauma, and the role of discourse in according such a status to an epidemic. I hope this will help us understand better the cultural discourse and narrative which has been developing around corona from a theoretical perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for such a beautiful interpretation of the idea encoded in the topic of cultural trauma and COVID-19. And I must draw the attention of the audience to the very theme of your lecture, which was summarized in the very beginning. That was very Indian concept and also global. That was one was the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and you initially stated that Sarve bhavantu sukhina, sarve santu niramaya, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kashyut bhag bhavet. Obviously, all that you have interwoven in your lecture, and we were enlightened about your axiological crisis, the concept of axiological crisis, value crisis. How does it play important role in disintegrating the solidarity, in disintegrating us, and the survival crisis? That is something really which must be kept in mind by all for a solid, for a united society. Survival crisis, that is something that very important role is played by this idea. So now, sir, with your kind permission, I would like to put forward certain views of some of the audience, and they want your take on that. Should I move ahead with the views or queries or comments?
No.
Only 2 to 3 I would be taking, as I know the constraint of time. You have another webinar also after this. So the first is by F. Alam, and Here, I think survival of natural crisis is akin to axiological crisis because the world believes that the coronavirus did not emerge naturally, but it is man-invented, just like gender and so on. What is your view? That blame game kind of thing, I don't know exactly, but still something is there.
Well, who am I to give my view? The scientists world over are trying to find out. So let us have patience, right? And we will soon know whether this virus is man-made or what, right? But there is, why should we speculate? You see, it is only when we indulge in speculations of this sort, right, what it would lead to. Suppose I come to the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, that it is invented by men, right? Then what will be the next logical step? I will look for the people or the person responsible for the inventing the virus, and in the manner of Donald Trump, I will start calling it Wuhan virus, China virus, this virus, that virus, right? So you see, this kind of, and even if it happened due to the negligence or ignorance of somebody, right? Can't we overlook? You see, we are looking for finding a scapegoat. We are indulging in a blame game. We are looking for a sort of easy prey. Who we can blame, right? Everybody is looking at China. But nobody is looking at China, how China controlled it, right? The only perspective from which we are looking at China, look, China has done this. China is responsible for this, right? But none of us are bothered, or none of the governments are bothered, as to what steps Chinese or the Chinese government took, or the Chinese people took, in order to control. And now they have successfully done it, right? But that doesn't occur to our mind. The only thing that comes to our mind is who did it, who is responsible, right? So, but I, for one, raise my hands. I do not know whether it is man-made or it has, in a way, all diseases are man-made, in the sense that what we are doing to nature, right? In a way, we are all responsible. Right? Look at our modern lifestyle, right? And the way we are going against the laws of nature, right? गर्मी है तो एसी लगा लो, right? जाड़ा है तो हीटर लगा लो. We are all working against the ways of the nature. And as I said in the very beginning of my talk, in the very beginning of my lecture, that there are limits to what science and technology can do to nature. Look what had happened in Badrinath. You remember several years ago, the tremendous flood that had occurred, which sort of washed away the entire Kedarnath Dham and Badrinath Dham. Now, again, human beings were responsible. But if we are looking in terms of making an accusation against one community, one nation, sorry, friend, I don't want to be party to it. I have no answer. I really give up. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Another observation
And
is
I would
there,
also
and
like
certain
to add,
views.
I would also like to add, the whole focus of my
Yes,
lecture,
sir.
the whole hang of my lecture was to overcome, to go beyond such tendencies of scapegoating and indulging in a blame game. Right? Thank you.
Yes, sir. Should I take the next one? though you have already responded, but still there is that in different critical concepts, culture is considered to be opposite to nature and condemned to be artificial, materialistic, and if
Well, what should I say? Should I deliver another lecture to tell you about culture? Culture is also about how you live in harmony with nature. Right? Culture is also about how you live in harmony with nature. Right? There is a term in Hindi which is called apsanskriti. Right? When you goes against the ways of the nature. Right? So as human beings, we are the unique species who can shape and influence our surroundings. No other animals can do that. Right? And it is our solemn responsibility to develop our culture responsibly, not to destroy nature, but to enrich nature. And if you look at the pre-modern culture, right, majority of it, very broadly speaking, right, I am not going into the details of it. You see, majority of what we call the pre-modern, or what is nowadays known as traditional culture, it was all about living in harmony with nature, to develop harmony with nature, not going against nature. And long ago, I mean, those of us who are students of deconstruction and so on and so forth, this binary between nature and culture, right? So that has already long been deconstructed and dismantled. So that's briefly my response, but I can go on. Yes.
okay, sir. Only two more we have.
Yogesh.
One,
Yogesh.
is it fear or collective consciousness which makes, yeah,
I think you.
Yes,
you should
Rajesh?
take this Sapna Kumari's question, the last one, because that is really a question. Rest of things.
Yeah.
And Yogesh, one request. I'm
Yes, sir.
enjoying it very much, but as
Yes,
I
please.
told you my constraint, I have another webinar at 5 o'clock where I have to speak at 5 o'clock. So
Yes, sir.
I think between I
Last
need
question.
Yes, sir.
a gap. So one last query or
This is the last one. Last
it
one.
will be better
Sapna Kumari's question.
if you read out some comments also rather than queries. What people have made of.
So many comments are there from the very beginning. That
Okay,
is,
go ahead with the question.
this.
Sapna Kumari's question. That is really a good question.
Okay, I will go ahead with the question. So, how far is the cultural crisis and trauma narrative affected the gap between individual interpretation and the community representation since experiences differ?
Will you please,
So, as researchers,
repeat
I
your
will
voice?
repeat. How far is the culture?
Will you please repeat
Sure,
it? Your
sir.
voice is not
Sure.
coming through.
How
clearly.
far is this? Rajesh, please read, because maybe there is some problem on my part.
Yes, some network issues are there, sir. It is there in the chat box,
Rajesh.
and I'm reading it. Okay.
Huh.
So Ms. Sapna Kumari is asking, sir, how far is this cultural crisis and trauma narrative affected by the gap existing between individual interpretation and a community representation since experiences differ?
Hello.
So, as researchers, how do we approach such narrative of crisis and trauma in literature especially? How should we build an objective understanding out of such varied experiential knowledge?
I didn't get the
आप
question.
यूजी है या पीजी स्टूडेंट है?
सर ये उस सर
अंडरग्रेजुएट
इसमें
तो
होगा
अपने कॉलेज
चैट
के नोडल
बॉक्स में
ऑफिसर
है
से
ना
बात करिए, मैं अभी मीटिंग में हूँ। आप अपने कॉलेज के नोडल ऑफिसर से बात
Okay, it is there in the chat. Thank you.
हेलो।
सपना कुमारी का क्वेश्चन है सर ये।
Yes. It is there. How
तो आप
far is
अपने
this-
S12 का कुछ
योगेश माइक ऑफ। Yes sir.
How far is this cultural crisis and trauma narrative affected by the gap existing between individual interpretation and a community representation since experiences differ? Today, Sapna, to cut a long answer short, I will refer you to a book. I'm forgetting the name of the writer. This is a book, if you can do Google search, right? This is a book on the Spanish flu. And that author, that writer, she's a woman scholar. She talks about the differences between the individual interpretation and community representation. In the case of a Spanish flu, because as I told you earlier, how a Spanish flu was not given the status of cultural trauma. Nonetheless, individuals did suffer. And what that lady does, unfortunately, I cannot recall the name of that lady, but you do Google search and you'll find it. Right? She went and met such people who were afflicted by the Spanish flu and interviewed them and collected their experiences and narrated them. And that is a very revealing document. Right? And that's why I say, when the next part of your question is, as researchers, how do we approach such narrative of crisis and trauma in literature, especially? How should we build an objective understanding out of such varied experiential knowledge? Now you see, objectivity is basically a chimera, but nevertheless, as I said, you have to wait. I was talking about the 4 stages in this pandemic discourse, and I did talk about the 4th and the last discourse, which I called subsidence and retrospection. The time for moral retrospection comes only when the event is long over, right? Right in the thick, right in the middle of the event, your assessment can only be tentative, because what is your assessment today might change tomorrow, depending on the course of the pandemic, what course it takes, right? But it is only after the event is over, long over, that you can sort of correlate between individual experiences and different kinds of collective experiences. And you also have a kind of a narrative distance. Right now, we are in the middle of it. So, to achieve that kind of critical distancing, in order to have an objective view of it, to have an objective perception of it, at the moment, I believe is not possible. We will have to wait. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Tiwari, for a formal vote of thanks to Professor Sanjay Kumar and our whole team.
Thank you, Yogesh sir, and a special thanks to Professor Sanjay Kumar for such a beautiful, enlightening, informative, as well as entertaining lecture. On behalf of English for Nation, I thank all the respected dignitaries and participants. And to listen to Professor Sanjay Kumar is a pleasure, as well as a pleasure for all of us, and a privilege too. Your interpretation of Camus' plague in the present scenario was mind-blowing, and we must take material from our research. You have proved it once again. And finally, hubris and complacency are even more dangerous than this corona disease. Thank you, sir, for such a beautiful lecture. And a special thanks goes to Dr. Yogesh Kumar Dubey and Dr. Rajesh Verma and all the spirited members of English for Nation and Vasant Kanya Mahavidyalaya for organizing such a beautiful platform for all the participants and all of us. Thank you once again, sir. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Janmeja, and many thanks to Dr. Beena ma'am also.
Sorry, I forgot her
name.
name. Many thanks for the moderation, Veena ma'am. Thank you very much
For the introduction. Okay, thank you. Thanks to all of you.